The Soviet-Afghan War, also known as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, was an armed incursion by Soviet forces into the territory of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan to prop up the faltering socialist government there and defeat the Mujahideen insurgency. It lasted from 1979 to 1989. Afghanistan, a country historically lodged between the large empires of Britain and Russia, had been a front of conflict between the two colonial powers. Through 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, the last of which ending in 1919, the British and Russians agreed to make Afghanistan a buffer state between their empires to avoid competition, establishing its modern borders by giving it the Wakhan Corridor. With the liberalization of Afghanistan in the 1960s by King Zahir Shah, new political parties began to form, most influential of which the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a Marxist-Leninist party that seeked to establish a Soviet-inspired government in Afghanistan. However, the party soon split into 2 camps, the Parchamites, moderates who believed in slow reform, and the Khalqis, who pushed for a violent revolution similar to that of Russia. In July 1973, while King Zahir Shah was on vacation in Italy, his government was overthrown by his cousin, the former Prime Minister Daoud Khan. While a few police officers were killed in small skirmishes, it was largely a bloodless abolishment of the Afghan monarchy, with Khan proclaiming the Republic of Afghanistan on the 17th of July 1973. As Khan began to crack down on the PDPA, arresting and executing key members, the Communists decided to make their move. In April 1978, through the Tsar Revolution, the PDPA overthrew the Republican government, killing Khan and his family in the process. From this point onward, the country would be known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Taraki became president, with Amin as his prime minister. Both were Khalqi members. Although the PDPA controlled the government, they did not control the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. Their policies of centralizing agriculture and removing control of villages from the tribal elders were very unpopular actions, and an armed rebellion movement of Muslims and anti-government fighters known as the Mujahideen began to form, threatening Taraki and Amin's control. However, the Mujahideen were not the only threat to Taraki. While Taraki struggled to maintain control of the country, Amin had begun to resent him for continually dismissing his suggestions, and began making moves to overthrow him. When a gunfight broke out between Taraki's guards, which ended with Amin being wounded, Amin commanded the army to arrest Taraki. Amin then announced to the Afghan people that Taraki, having fallen ill, had given control over to him. Taraki, meanwhile, was strangled in his bed by Amin's assassins. This internal conflict, paired with Amin's purging of Parchamite moderates, did not help the PDPA's position, and by October 1979, Amin had control of less than 20% of the country. With the situation quickly deteriorating in Afghanistan, the Soviet leadership realized they could not afford to sit idly any longer. Amin had been begging the Soviets for military support, a move which would be unpopular with both the Afghan and Soviet peoples. However, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev reluctantly agreed to send a unit of special forces to be stationed outside of Amin's hilltop palace. Amin expressed his gratitude for the aid, though he would find out too late that the unit was not there to protect him. In the night of the 27th of December 1979, the Soviet Special Forces, dressed in Afghan uniforms, executed a surprise assault on Amin's palace, killing or capturing most of the guards outside. Once inside the palace, the heavily armed and armored Soviet attackers engaged the most trusted of Amin's guard in close, violent skirmishes. When the power to the building was cut, the Soviet troops, using loud, vulgar Russian swear words, alerted the Afghan guards to the fact that they were being attacked by Soviets, not the Mujahideen. Most of the guards surrendered following this, and Amin, resigned to his fate, was identified and executed, bringing an end to his short reign. To accompany the raid on the palace, on Christmas Day 1979, the Soviet 40th Army, consisting of over 80,000 men, moved into Afghanistan to take control of the main highways and cities. In Kabul, the Soviets installed Babrak Kamal, a previously exiled Parchamite, as the new leader of the country, hoping he would be more moderate than his predecessors. While the arrival of Soviet troops was generally welcomed by the Afghan civilians, they were cautioned to leave just as quickly. Internationally, the invasion was condemned by the West as an attempt to subjugate Afghanistan as a Soviet puppet state, with the execution of Amin not helping the Soviets' case. While the Soviet intervention was initially welcomed by the Afghan populace, the Mujahideen insurgency viewed it as a foreign invasion by a godless enemy. Before long, open conflict erupted between the Soviets and the Mujahideen, now supplied by the West, and the former were forced to dig in, meaning the limited contingent of the 40th Army would soon become unwelcome long-term residents. By the mid-1980s, it was evident that the Soviets, though unwillingly, were in Afghanistan to stay. Abandoning her ally, the PDPA, would mean admitting to the world that the Soviet Union, supposedly the world's greatest military power, had lost to unorganized tribes of shepherds and farmers. Additionally, it would shake the hope the Soviet satellite states in Europe had in their overseer, revealing that the Union could not actually protect her Warsaw Pact allies. In essence, the only remaining option for the Soviets was to continue their incursion, hoping the spirit of the Mujahideen would break before their own. During the reign of the Afghan communists and the presence of Soviet troops, Afghanistan was grounds for some of the worst atrocities of the 1980s. The complete destruction of villages suspected of being sympathetic to the Mujahideen was a common tactic, forcing over one-third of the Afghan population to flee the country, with up to 10% being killed. Accusations of genocide cannot be ruled out, as these killings mainly took place in the rural regions of the Pashtuns, assumed by the Soviets to be most prone to assisting the Mujahideen. In response, captured Soviet soldiers were often decapitated and cut into pieces, and trucks filled with sacks of human body parts were common gifts to Soviet officials in Kabul. The war, clouded in secrecy to the average Soviet citizen, became increasingly unpopular as the bodies of sons and fathers started coming home in zinc coffins, with the families being instructed to bury their dead in silence and not to speak of it. At a time when the Soviet Union was entering its rapid decline, and with the catastrophe at Chernobyl in Soviet Ukraine, the extended incursion in Afghanistan was something the Soviet people heavily criticized where they could get away with it. In 1985, after the death of Leonid Brezhnev and the scramble for a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev became the head of the Soviet Union. Younger and more progressive than his predecessors, Gorbachev soon accepted the futility of the war in Afghanistan, and he announced the slow withdrawal of the 40th Army from the country. The Afghan government was outraged at this decision, but was powerless to stop it. The withdrawal lasted from 1986 to early 1989, with the last Soviet soldier leaving Afghanistan on the 15th of February 1989. The Mujahideen, keen now on destroying the communist government in Kabul, generally allowed the Soviets to evacuate safely. Mothers, wives, and girlfriends alike waited at the border to welcome the soldiers home, while the troops tried to smuggle as much loot and souvenirs as possible through the Soviet customs. Now standing alone against the Mujahideen, the Afghan communists began to lose control of the country. In 1992, Najibullah stepped down, and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was abolished, leaving behind a power vacuum and sparking the Afghan Civil War. In 1994, a group of fundamentalist Muslims formerly part of the Mujahideen formed the Taliban and quickly overpowered the other factions in the conflict. In a display of tying off loose ends, in 1996 the Taliban captured Najibullah, who was attempting to flee to the United States, torturing and lynching him in the streets of Kabul. Shortly afterwards, the Taliban solidified their control over the new Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. It wasn't long after the Taliban takeover that animosity towards the West intensified. The Afghan people felt their lives had been thrown against the Soviet war machine by the United States for her own gain. This culminated in the September 11th attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group led by Osama bin Laden, a former Mujahideen fighter. Following this, the West invaded Afghanistan in what would become a 20-year incursion, ending in a near-identical defeat and withdrawal to that suffered by the Soviets in 1989. As of 2023, the Taliban again controls the entirety of Afghanistan. Lasting just under 10 years, the Soviet-Afghan War changed the fate of both countries permanently. From Storm 333 in 1979 to the present day, Afghanistan has known not peace nor freedom. Death tolls from the war range from 600,000 to 2 million Afghans, with over 5 million forced to flee their homes to neighboring countries, often never to return. Soviet losses amount to 15,000 deaths, with the war heavily contributing to the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union.